Policing isn't supposed to be comfortable, it's supposed to be transformative. There are sacrifices that take place because ultimately it's for a bigger purpose than any of us. We're so used to seeing folks head to the streets to get their steps in without putting their foots on the neck of injustice afterwards. It's a thing they can post online to generate non-altruistic likes and comments. Essentially, it's a sweaty way of getting engagement. But the pursuit of integrity and equity can't occur in hours or even a few days. It's an ongoing process that requires strategizing, but ultimately an abandonment or an immolation of how things were to get to where things need to be. I digress. The fight against oppression is an eternal battle. As Black people, we know this. So with all the talk of protesting and boycotting, but don't boycott because I'm in this store, but whatever, girl. I just wanted to look back at some of the figures that we frequently associate with the movements of yesterday. And truthfully, are they yesterday? Because they're still going on. But anyway, figures like Claudette Colvin, Rosa Parks, Medgar and Myrlie Evers, and John Carlos, and see how their love stories were impacted because of the movement, or vice versa. And if you don't understand what I mean, just keep watching and just keep listening, because soon I'll... Welcome to another episode of I'll Tell You What, the podcast that's all love Black history. I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that shares these stories with you every single Monday. Thank you for watching on the Tube of You, and thank you for listening wherever you listen to your podcast. I forgot to mention this a while ago that we hit some milestones. Over 10,000 podcast downloads a few months ago, and we are actually approaching 10,000 subscribers on the Tube of You, which is not bad because at the beginning of January, we were at around 5,500. So, you know, we're gaining some ground, but I appreciate all of y'all. Thank you so much. If you have not subscribed to I'll Tell You What on the Tube of You, go ahead and do so, and make sure you turn those notifications on. And I'll Tell You What is on every social platform, but of all places, please make sure that you're following on Patreon to support the show. And because Black History Month is on the horizon, head to I'llTell.com to get you some merch. And if you haven't left a podcast review yet, please do so. It helps others like yourself discover the show. So, because I just told y'all last week how Coretta Scott King saw her husband, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., let's talk about the love stories of these figures of the movement. Claudette Colvin refused to get off the bus 9 months before Rosa Parks, and yet she wasn't the face of the Montgomery bus boycott. But do you know why? So in March of 1955, a 15-year-old Claudette Colvin sat down near the emergency door of the bus. Then, Black people knew that you could sit there if the bus wasn't full. Eventually, more white people got on the bus, and thus the expectation was to get up. But Claudette did nothing of the sort. She stayed seated. So because Claudette didn't move, the bus driver called the cops on her and she was arrested. Claudette told The Guardian, quote, "If it had been for an old lady, I would have got up, but it wasn't. I was sitting on the last seat that they said you could sit in. I didn't get up because I didn't feel like I was breaking the law." Then she became afraid as the cops were making lewd comments about her bra size, and she'd heard about cops that would SA Black women that they detained. Her arrest had her family shook because white folks didn't like it when you disobeyed, and they would show it by threatening or enacting violence. Though this became news and Claudette received letters and acknowledgments of her courage at a very young age, not much beyond that happened. So 9 months later, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks didn't get up from her seat after a long day of work. She was arrested, and literally days later, the Montgomery bus boycott began. So why wasn't Claudette the face of the boycott, though her situation happened earlier? A few reasons come to mind. One, Claudette was a teenager that came from a poor family. 2, Claudette was dark-skinned. But 3, and this is probably a very huge reason why, but teenage Claudette was pregnant. But she said, quote, nowadays you call it statutory rape, but back then it was just the kind of thing that happened. Ultimately, the leaders of the movement didn't feel that a dark-skinned, poor, pregnant teenager could change the hearts and minds of bigoted white people and even some prejudiced blacks as well. Don't forget, all the isms were still a thing at that time. So while she wasn't the face of the boycott, Claudette still played a very significant role in the civil rights movement. She was one of the 4 plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale back in 1956, the federal court case that led to the desegregation of buses in Montgomery. So while Claudette is one of the unsung figures of the civil rights movement, let's look at the woman who essentially took her place. Sorta? Their last name was Parks. Of course Rosa's husband had a car. So before I go on, have you seen Rosa's husband before? I'm picking up a little Adam Rodriguez, a little Bad Bunny. Anyway, Rosa Parks, born Rosa Louise McCauley, met Raymond Parks in spring of 1931 through a mutual friend. The timing was perfect because this white neighbor of hers that they called Mr. Charlie kept trying to get at her, and she was like, absolutely not. She didn't want to be in a racial relationship. So when Raymond, that's her husband's name, came into the picture, she was hesitant at first because y'all saw the man, he looked white enough. And Rosa wasn't really big on light brights, but that would change. When she got to know Raymond, she fell for him. She learned that he was well-read, a barber, and an activist. He was a member of the NAACP and was fundraising to support the defense of the Scottsboro Boys, a group of teenagers who were wrongly accused of ape-raying white women in the early 1930s. According to the biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, Raymond was the first person she could talk to about race in the world and all of the issues that just occurred in life at the time. Their courtship was short and they married on December 18th, 1932. At the time of their marriage, Rosa was 19 and Raymond was 29. Raymond encouraged Rosa to complete her high school education, which she did in 1933, which was a significant achievement considering that fewer than 7% of African Americans held a high school diploma at that time. Life for them went as normal, with Rosa also getting active in the NAACP. But life for them would change come December 1st, 1955. That was the day when Rosa tiredly sat down on that bus and didn't get up. The act of protest literally kicked off the Montgomery bus boycott that began 4 days later. Being the face of the boycott immortalized her in history books, but it wasn't all rainbows and daisies. The biography mentioned how the boycott year caused general frustrations, even in her marriage, because Raymond was upset that Rosa didn't get off the bus. Like, dang, girl, you could have gotten yourself hurt. The year-long boycott, plus being known for not getting up, caused threats to their lives and financial strains on their family. That led Rosa and Raymond, along with Rosa's mom, to move to Detroit to find work in the promise of a better life. There, Raymond continued his work as a barber, and Rosa remained active in civil rights, working as an aide to Congressman John Conyers Jr. from 1965 to 1988. Raymond passed away from throat cancer on August 19, 1977 in Detroit. Reflecting on their relationship later, Rosa described Raymond as, quote, the first real activist I ever met. Their nearly 45-year marriage was a true partnership grounded in mutual passions for the advancement of our people. Now, I'll tell you about another couple that was steadfast in the movement, yet is often forgotten in reflection. The relationship goals of the civil rights movement belongs to Medgar and Myrlie Evers. Joy Ann Reid opens her biography on Medgar and Myrlie with, quote, in the 1950s, Myrlie Louise Beasley fell inextricably in love with Medgar Wiley Evers. She loved him the moment she laid eyes on him on her first day at Alcorn A&M College, though she wouldn't dare to admit it. Then, Myrlie was just a freshman, and Medgar was an upperclassman who had served in the World War II. He was the kind of guy her grandma and auntie warned her about because they assumed those type of men were more worldly and cocky. However, that didn't matter. Myrlie said, quote, "Imagine a 17-year-old leaving home for the first time, and within an hour, you have this encounter with this man?" He stayed on my mind from that moment on. As they got to know one another, it was so clear that this was a mutual attraction. Before they even had their first kiss, Medgar told her, quote, "You're going to be the mother of my children." And when they finally crossed that bridge, she knew she wanted to be with him forever too. So let's fast forward to about a year after they met. On December 24th, 1951, Medgar and Myrlie got married in an intimate ceremony. From that day on, they weren't just husband and wife, they were a true team. Eventually, Medgar took on the role of the NAACP's first field secretary in Mississippi, investigating lynchings, organizing protests, and registering Black voters. Meanwhile, Myrlie held down their home and supported him every step of the way. She even, at one point, if I remember correctly, worked as his secretary. So by 1953, they had their first child, a son named Daryl, after experiencing a miscarriage the year before. And then the following year, they had another child, a daughter named Rena. And then they would have their third child, James Van, that they would call Van, in 1960. Being a leader in that climate meant that you and yours were threatened constantly. They dealt with phone calls, harassment, knowing they were being watched every single day. That even influenced the home that they purchased, where the entrance to the house was through the carport. There wasn't any other way that you could get into the home. So, even with all of that, their marriage stayed solid. Myrlie would later say Medgar made her feel safe, even in the chaos. And Medgar, he leaned on her strength, her wisdom, her calmness, especially when the weight of the work felt heavy. Then June 12, 1963 happened. Medgar had just arrived home from a long day. He had watched President John F. Kennedy give his famed speech on civil rights, then attended a NAACP meeting, then he had dinner, then he dropped off a colleague. Visibly exhausted, he drove home instead of staying over and driving home in the morning. Daryl and Rena were still awake after watching President Kennedy's address. Myrlie and Van had fallen asleep. They instantly woke up to the sound of gunshots outside. Now, days before, Myrlie and Medgar joked about a possible threat on their lives when Myrlie sat on a chair by the window in the front of their home. That lighthearted moment quickly became serious as Myrlie discerned Medgar's concern over something happening not only to him, but to her and their kids. He said, quote, "Myrlie, you are stronger than you think you are." She would soon find out just how true that sentiment was. She carefully made her way to the carport where she saw her husband, quote, lying face down in a pool of blood. Myrlie's screams woke their neighbors that apparently hadn't heard the gunshots moments before. Several neighbors came by to help put Medgar in a station wagon and carry him to the hospital since the ambulance never arrived. As they carried him on, Myrlie knew in her heart of hearts that she would never see her husband alive again. The days and the months afterwards weren't easy for Myrlie, as you would imagine. She had to manage her own grief as well as trying to help her children, who all processed their father's death differently. And to make matters even sadder, about a month after her husband was unalived, Myrlie miscarried. But she vowed to keep her promise to him to take care of their kids and continue the movement work and show that she wasn't just a, quote, professional widow, which was a category she refused to fall in. Myrlie continues to honor Medgar's legacy even today. She really loved her some him, but knew the sacrifice of being married to a leader of the movement would eventually be costly. Now, I want to move us a few years to the late 1960s to share with you another story about love and protest. I'm pretty pretty sure you don't know how John Carlos's involvement in the protests during the 1968 Olympics impacted his marriage. The year 1968 was very loaded for Black Americans, especially anyone remotely involved or in tune with the civil rights movement. In April, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was unalived. A week later, the Fair Housing Act was enacted, which, let's check back on the status of that one later. In June, the good Robert F. Kennedy Sr. was unalived after coming in second in the California primaries. And as athletes, John and Tommy Smith, along with others, realized that there were other injustices they were upset about and they wanted to boycott. One, South Africa and Rhodesia were invited to participate in the Olympics despite being apartheid nations. 2, extreme right-winger Avery Brundage was the president of the International Olympic Committee. He was against the Black athletes' request for more Black coaches because he found that to be, quote, irrelevant. He was known to have led an autocracy, which even the official Olympics website describes his reign as president as, quote, the most controversial of any IOC president. And finally, they wanted Muhammad Ali to get his heavyweight boxing title back. So keep that in mind when we go to October during the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, where John and Tommy made history with the protests that you've probably seen plenty of times. So after finishing third and first, respectively, in the 200-meter race, John and Tommy walked to the podium for their medal ceremony. As the U.S. national anthem played, they bowed their heads and raised their gloved fists in a Black Power salute. John wrote, quote, as the anthem began and the crowd saw us raise our fists, the stadium became eerily quiet. Then, as the national anthem played in full force, the calm before the storm ended and the boos start coming down. He said that they were screaming, not even singing the anthem, just like screaming it. As they headed back to the Olympic Village to reunite with their families, the reality of their actions definitely set in. The media didn't make things easier. As John's wife, Kim, tried to return to the village, he wrote, quote, one of these reporters recognized her as my wife. 100 reporters ran up to her, and suddenly she was in the middle of something neither of us were prepared for. He went on to mention how they were pulling on her, screaming at her, and just overall causing a very scary scene. John found out and went to rescue her. And after that, just about every publication had something negative to say about them. John noted how all of the news sources had been pulled from the village because he assumed that the whole world was essentially talking about their protests, and the IOC just didn't want them to see it. The Los Angeles Times reported that they engaged in a, quote, Nazi-like salute. Oh, this is a Nazi salute? But what that one man did wasn't? You know what? The backlash was swift and severe, as you'd imagine. The U.S. Olympic Committee expelled both athletes from the games and sent them home. John said, quote, as for Kim and me, we just tried to shut all those things out of our minds. We tried to just focus on the greatest asset that we had, each other. I leaned on Kim, and maybe I leaned too much. The opportunities for work were slim. John wrote that HBCUs would request that he and Tommy would go speak, but they didn't really have large budgets, so it's not like they really made a lot of money off of those opportunities. And he wrote that the FBI would begin to send photos of himself with different women that he met while on these different campus visits back to his wife. Quote, it got to my wife to the point where she was so paranoid every time I went out the door, it was like I was after some woman. This started the very unraveling of my family. Since John struggled to find consistent work and they were handling the notoriety of who he was and what he did, the stress of all this caused tension in their marriage. Years later, John wrote, quote, we were living on one steady income and it was from my wife, Kim. This began to impact both of their mental health, but definitely Kim's. In 1977, the weight of it all was just too much to bear. The protests of the Olympics made John a pariah, which made it hard for him to get or keep a job. And there were all these rumors of his alleged infidelity that he kept having to manage. And even though they had separated, it was just a lot. It was a lot. So in 1977, Kim unalived herself. John said, quote, "I've never been the same since." So what was a great display of solidarity for many causes and the hope to improve the conditions for Black athletes in the Olympics ultimately led John Carlos and his wife down a fatal path. Protests, the civil rights movement, and love were deeply intertwined in ways most people probably don't realize. So in 1955, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, 9 months before Rosa Parks made history. Claudette's bravery was applauded, but her age, the color of her skin, her family's economic status, and the fact that she was a pregnant teenager made civil rights leaders wary of presenting her as the face of the boycott. Instead, her efforts culminated in the Browder versus Gale trial of 1956, where she and 3 other Black women testified about their experiences with bus segregation. Their courage led to a federal ruling that declared segregated buses unconstitutional, effectively ending the year-long Montgomery bus boycott. While Rosa became the enduring symbol of the boycott, Claudette's role in this landmark victory remains a vital part of history. Now, Rosa's story was tied to her husband, Raymond Parks. Married for nearly 45 years, their union was built on shared activism and resilience. However, the boycott brought threats and financial strain to their family. This made them move to Detroit. And Medgar and Myrlie Evers faced the unthinkable. After meeting in college, their bond deepened as they got married, and Medgar became a leader in the NAACP, investigating lynchings and organizing protests. But in 1963, he was unalived in their driveway, leaving Myrlie to raise their 3 children while continuing his fight for justice. And similarly, John Carlos's raised fist during the 1968 Olympics remains a powerful symbol of protest. However, the backlash devastated his career and his marriage. His wife, Kim, endured media harassment and FBI manipulation, leading to her tragic suicide in 1977, a heartbreaking reminder of the personal costs of activism. Now, these stories, and I'm sure so many more, should remind us that love and sacrifice can be inseparable in the fight for justice. And that, Aisle Runners, concludes this episode of I'll Tell You What. Please make sure you subscribe, follow, share, leave a review wherever you get your podcast, even if you're watching on the Tube of You or on Patreon. And definitely come back next week for another episode in Love Black History. But if you're following on social, tune in every day because I'll be sharing different love stories every day throughout the month of February. See y'all in the pews.